Evening, everyone. I would like to welcome everyone to the League of Women Voters of Atlanta, Fulton. What is the Senate Bill 202 all about event? I'm Demetrius Johnson, the Vice President of Voter Services Committee. At this time, I will turn it over to Darlene Kahn.
Good evening, everyone, once again. Thank you for joining the League of Women Voters at Atlanta, Fulton this evening for an informative dialogue on what is Senate Bill 202 all about. My name is Darlene Kimes, a member of the board. We are pleased to have two of Georgia's most influential women and panelists with us this evening to discuss the impact of this bill on Georgia voters. We have Ms. Helen Butler. Ms. Butler is Executive Director for the Georgia Coalition of the People Agenda, an advocates organization comprised of representatives from the human rights, civil rights, environmental, labor, peace, and justice groups throughout the state of Georgia and other southeastern states. She knows more about voting rights, who votes, who does not vote, where the polls are located, which polls get closed, and much, much more than any individual in Atlanta and the state of Georgia. She is a walking, talking voter advocacy. Ms. Butler. Next, we have Ms. Susannah Scott. Susannah Scott is the president of the Georgia League of Women Voters. Experiencing technical difficulty right here. I'm so sorry. Ms. Scott is our president of the Georgia League of Women Voters. An active participation in government. It influences public policy through education and advocacy. They never support or oppose any political party or candidate. The League of Women Voters has two separate and distinct roles: voter services, citizens education, where they present unbiased, nonpartisan information about the election and the voting process, and issues and action advocacy, where they also Okay, and next we have Ms. Candace Presley. Ms. Presley is works with the community service for WSB Television. She is a two-time award winner for broadcasting, and Ms. Presley is the Family to Family program for the WSB television station. And now I'll give to you Ms. Candace Presley.
Thank you so much for such a kind introduction, and we are delighted to be with you this evening for an in-depth, deep dive conversation about Senate Bill 202. Just what is it? Now, before we get into the meat of this bill, we know there's been a lot of press, much of the press, very negative about all the things that will hinder a voter as opposed to helping a voter. There has to be, Susannah, something in the legislation that is beneficial. If so, what is it?
There is actually a couple of things that are good in this bill, and definitely want to highlight the good as well as the problematic. So one of the new sections allows or requires 7 days notice before and on the day of an election if a polling place is changed, and they require very visible notice. 4 foot by 4 foot signage at the previous polling locations of people who are going to go to their old polling place thinking that's where they're supposed to be. They'll have very, very visible signage about where they need to go. And they have to have that notice up for 7 days before the election. So that's really good. And also they are allowing election officials to start processing absentee ballots early so that there's not a backlog. I think we saw some of that backlog in June, and that won't be as much of a problem, hopefully, going forward because of that one addition to the law. Ms. Helen, do you remember if there's anything else that really good things that I'm forgetting about?
Well, the good thing is the no excuse voting is still there. There's no changes to the voter registration laws, right? So that's a good thing. You did talk about publishing information on a website. So they now have to have a website, or they have to give it to the Secretary of State's office to really publish that information. So that's the good thing, I would say, about this bill.
I'm going to stay with you, Ms. Butler. Governor Kemp has signed SB 202 into law. Can changes be made to the law? And if so, how would that work?
Well, right now, according to Georgia law, the law is the laws, but there is a process that we can get it changed by advocating to our Senate to pass S1, which would take care of some of these bad provisions in the law, as well as asking them to put forth HR 4, which is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, would put pre-clearance back into place so that any of these things would have to get pre-cleared before they can be implemented. So that's what we need them to do right now, is call their congressional delegation, their congresspeople and their senators.
So again, you're saying that SB 1 and HR 4 are federal pieces of legislation. So again, we're talking to our congressional representatives, Senator Warnock or Senator Ossoff, correct?
Correct. That's correct.
Does after the election mean the next election cycle, or indeed the next election? For example, if there was a primary election with long lines, would the changes need to be made before the general election or before the next primary election? Who wants to tackle that? Ms. Butler, I'm going to stay with you.
Well, with the primary, it says, the law says the next general election is when it would have to, the changes would have to happen. If there's a problem with lines, it would have to be taken care of at the next general election that occurs.
Susannah, what are the implications of leaving a deceased candidate on the ballot? Could this potentially cause a county and the district some additional financial burden because they would then have to execute a special election?
Yes, and I think voters in Atlanta Fulton saw this in action this last election cycle. When Representative John Lewis died, he remained on the ballot. Well, he would have remained on the ballot. They had they had to have a special election to fill it, or to replace him on the ballot later on in the year. And it was very confusing, and it added to multiple elections, which I think added to voter fatigue, added to voter confusion. So I think one of the things they're trying to do is to simplify the process and make sure that it's clear how that all deceased candidates are treated the same way, and that there is a clear process in place so that voters aren't going to get confused. And it will end up, I think, it should help defray some of the costs of having to have special elections. So that part, I will say that's another one of the good things, trying to create some standardization and clarity around how we handle deceased candidates before an election.
Helen Butler, according to the new legislation, polling locations can only be brick and mortar locations. What's the difference between the county-run mobile voting, the buses that we saw in Fulton County in 2020, and that of a physical brick and mortar building?
Well, what the new law says is that there can be any polling location that is a movable. In other words, it's on wheels or whatever, it can be moved. It cannot occur unless there is a declared emergency by the governor. And so therefore, Fulton County and the other counties that have purchased these mobile units, they can't use them as polling locations. They may find some other use for them, but they can't be used as polling locations unless there is a declared emergency by the governor.
Can you think of an example of what such a declared emergency might be?
like COVID, like he declared when COVID came along, or if there had been a tornado, say in a particular area, they could use a mobile unit and it destroyed the regular building, they could use a mobile unit for that. That's an emergency situation.
Susannah, you look like as if you had something that you wanted to add.
No, well, I was thinking this bill changed a lot over the course. Actually, there were multiple versions of this bill and multiple bill numbers that had a lot of the same things. At one point, they wanted to require every jurisdiction to have a mobile voting unit, which, you know, is not necessarily quite an expense. So I think it's good that they didn't say we could not have mobile units, but they have really locked us into making them sort of unusable, except in very rare circumstances. I could see it being a problem down the coast if there's a hurricane. Here in Atlanta, again, you know, anywhere in the state if there's a tornado, but it's just, I was struck by the fact that this was definitely something that kept coming up and changing over the course of the legislative session.
Also, SB 202 says the Secretary of State will no longer chair the state election board, and that the new state election board chair must be nonpartisan and appointed by a majority of the state House and state Senate. Is the governor's appointment interim until the General Assembly is back in session, or is that a permanent appointment?
So if there's a vacancy when the General Assembly is out of session, so like if a vacancy occurred right now, then yes, the governor would appoint someone to hold that position until the next legislative session. And so it would not be permanent. When the General Assembly came back into session, they would have the option of making that appointment permanent or choosing their own candidate to serve as the chair of the SEB.
And that person is limited to two-year terms. So it technically, it is not a permanent position. It is a 2-year term. And so they have the option of changing it each time.
Yeah.
Ms. Butler, do you see that as a positive or troublesome provision of the law?
Very troublesome. The whole takeover control process that this introduces is just problematic totally. It takes the accountability to voters away, because this is an appointed position by the legislature. It answers only to the legislature. It does not answer to voters. So it has no accountability to us. It makes it very partisan. It gives the legislature total control of the state election board, because they have 3 members of that board. So it is totally problematic and is something that we don't support. We think that position should be accountable to the voters.
Susannah, is that one of the reasons where at last check there are as many as 8 lawsuits filed challenging SB 202?
It's one of the reasons. I've got to be honest, I haven't read all of the lawsuits, but it is, I know that's been a serious concern for a number of our partners in the, the nonprofits election protection sphere, is the fact that there is that lack of accountability that Ms. Butler just mentioned. We need to know that, that we have recourse if the state election board is acting in a really partisan way. Elections is one of the ways we do that. And if none of those board members are elected by the people, then that really diminishes the power of us as voters.
Most of the lawsuits contend that they prohibit or discriminate in the process or access to the ballot by voters. So most of the lawsuits are filed along that line of reasoning.
Ms. Butler, talk to us about this performance review component of the law, and can you explain to our audience what the process is expected to be for creating objective criteria for said review?
Well, I can tell you what it's supposed to do and how it's supposed to be constituted. In terms of the objective qualifications, that hasn't been determined because that would have to be promulgated by the state election board. The setup of it is the state election board can appoint, well, it's a 3-person performance review board. One is a member of the state election board staff. 2 are other election officials who are not impacted by the non-performance jurisdiction. So if it's Fulton County, then they could have Cobb County and the CAB Board of Election people be a member of that, but it couldn't be someone else from Fulton County Board, Fulton County that would oversee it. But it would be a 3-member board. And again, the objectivity, we don't know what they'll be judged on other than it says if they have made any violations of the law, if there have with 2 or 3, I think it's 2 or 3 violations of the law, that they have within a 2-year election cycle had so many problems, malfeasance, non-feasance as requirements, then they are allowed to be replaced, and the board can make a review and make a determination. The board gives they have to do an investigation, give a report to the state election board, and the state election board acts upon that report.
Is this a term limited position?
It's supposed to be based on a petition that some elected official or some board member says that there's a problem with, or the state election board itself can say that it's a problem, but they have to do this performance review investigation. So it would be determined if it is. They can, I guess you would say, is it permanent? They have the option of replacing a current supervisor of election or a current voter of the member of election based on this petition. The election supervisor would be removed, suspended. They put in a temporary replacement. That person can stay in there for 90 days. I think, is that correct, Susannah? 90 days that they can stay in. And based on the report, if the state election board decides not to accept, or they don't think that this person or this board can improve, they could actually deny them being reinstated. The election supervisor has 30 to 90 days to ask for reinstatement. And if they don't ask for reinstatement within that time period, then it's a permanent removal. But again, they have a period of time where they can ask for reinstatement, but that doesn't mean they get back in, because the state election board has the ultimate desire as to whether they will put them back in based on this performance review board's report.
Susannah, talk to our audience about this new state oversight committee. How does it work? And does it have the authority to remove folks who are serving on the board as an election director or sitting on the election board?
So the oversight, I think, works in a similar way to the performance review committee. And so they can look at, whether or not a particular jurisdiction or county is having issues, and can go in and require an evaluation to see whether or not there are any problems. They can recommend improvements. And if those improvements aren't taken on board, then they can recommend that a performance review be done and potentially, remove a superintendent or a board of election member or members. So it's very similar in that regard. They have a lot of power, but they can only exercise that power, I think, in 4 different counties at any given time. So their power is limited in the fact that they can only really impact 4 counties at a go. but that doesn't mean that they can't be like, looking into all of the counties, all 159 counties. They can definitely be spending a lot of time looking, which is not necessarily a bad thing. That if there are improvements that can be made, technologies advance, things change. It doesn't hurt to have someone offer suggestions on how we can improve. But the fact that, this could lead to people losing their jobs, and there not being a lot of, as Ms. Helen just said, there's not a lot of opportunity to defend yourself once the state election board decides that you need to be removed. Your options are really limited. So it's a lot of power for a small group of people who, again, are not elected.
So then, how does somebody get on this oversight committee? Is it the same way that somebody would be appointed to the state election board?
So I believe the state election board, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Helen, but I believe the state election board picks the oversight committee. So they will, they'll select someone to lead that committee, and then the people who will be on it to do that work. So they will, I think, hire one person who's like the superintendent of oversight. And it's all with the state election board makes those hiring decisions.
What are you talking about? The one that oversees the state election, the independent person that's going to be the chair, or just the oversight committee?
How do you get on the oversight committee?
It's like Susannah said, the state election board actually gets to pick.
And in what ways might the state election board guarantee or assure voters that the people who are on the oversight committee as well as the performance review committee have the will of all Georgia voters at heart? Ms. Butler?
I can't really assure you that as I see it. It's going to be their selection, and their selection could be biased. They could appoint just certain people. It doesn't have to represent everyone. So there's no specific criteria that has been set for the type of people that would go there. But the state election board makes those appointments. And I know for the performance review board, there's one for every from every district that has 4 more representatives. You get to choose one. For one districts that have less than delegation that has less than 4, you get to pick one. So but again, the decision is left up to the state election board.
Is it legal for the Georgia legislature to remove a constitutional officer, in this case, and for the purposes of this discussion, the Secretary of State from the elections board without a change to the Georgia Constitution?
I would need to go and double check the Constitution, but I don't think that duty is specified in the Constitution. So again, I would have to double check the state Constitution, but I don't believe that is specifically addressed in the Constitution. So yes, they can change things. I mean, there was talk before the session began about different ways that they could limit the power of the Secretary of State, some of which would have required a constitutional amendment. I think this was the workaround that allowed them to limit the Secretary of State's power and authority without requiring the citizens to weigh in through a constitutional amendment process.
I see. The state election board, county commissioners, or a certain number of state House and Senate members that represent a county could ask for an independent group to do a performance review of their local elections board or probate judge that supervises the elections. Who, again, it's all about these committees and how do you get on them? Who would appoint and select this independent group?
So my reading was that the Secretary of State can appoint 3 competent persons to serve on the member of the performance review board. So he, right now, as that one is written, Secretary of State decides, and he gets to decide who is competent to sit in that position. It does limit or does require that one of those people be an employee of his office, and that, as you know, with the other review board that Ms. Helen was just talking about, also can't be someone who serves in the elections in the county that's going to be investigated. So
Ms. Butler, you look like you wanted to weigh in also.
No, that was right. I was just saying, yes, that is the way that it's done. I mean, they've had so many versions of this, and I have so many versions in my head. I have to remember the last version that they put forth, because this process wasn't transparent. We had to try to keep up with it every day to be able to know which version we're talking about today and which version is the final version that we're going to work with. And I've read it 100 times, but yet when you're not looking at every line of it, you can go back to, oh, was it this line or was it that line? But Susannah said it correctly.
And I, to that
ahead,
point,
Susannah,
I
yeah.
mean, there were days when we got 3 different amendments to these bills on the same day. So they would issue an amendment right before they opened up testimony in committee hearings. And so people were testifying on a version of the bill that was no longer valid. So it was a very non-transparent process. And I think they voted on the final version of the bill when it was still just a 2-page bill up on the public website for your average voter to look at. We didn't see that final version of the bill until after it had been signed by the governor.
An independent group could be requested to conduct a performance review of their appointed election board. The board could temporarily suspend up to 4 election superintendents, only 4 at a time. Ladies, are the results of the performance review of the independent group, this is a lot of legalese, it's no wonder everyone was confused, are the results of the performance review of the independent group meant to be advisory in nature or binding on the state elections board?
It's supposed to be an investigative report, and the state election board acts upon that report. So I guess it's an advisory thing.
It
but
says
it
may.
Yeah, so it could be binding, because if that's what they use, it is binding. So that recommendation, but it's supposed to be an advisory, I guess you'd call it, advisory report.
Ladies, I think our viewers would really like to hear a little bit more from you on something that you said just a couple of moments ago about the lack of transparency in the process of crafting this particular law. Susannah, you said there were days when there would be a committee hearing and there would be testimony and people would be testifying on a version of the bill that was no longer valid. Can you share with the audience other examples of some of the challenges that you all and the League of Women Voters faced in trying to hold accountable our lawmakers for this process?
Well, I mean, that was one of the big ones. And I know I submitted testimony in writing because I could not go down to the Capitol in person, but I know members of Ms. Helen's team were down there in person, and Ms. Helen herself was there on occasion. And yeah, I know that there were times when they were testifying about a version that they hadn't seen. We did have some legislators sending us versions of the bills once they had them so that we could try and keep up. But the other thing that was going on was that there was a Senate bill that was 241. That was one version. Oh, that was the first Senate omnibus bill. And then there was the House omnibus 531. Those both changed multiple times during the course of the legislative session. Once they passed out of their chambers and went into committee hearings in the opposite chambers, they again went through a lot of changes. And I know I worked really closely with Cindy Battles, who's with the People's Agenda, on sort of trying to make sure that we understood what was going on in these bills so that we could talk sensibly about them and testify about them. And we had prepped for 241 because we thought that was the version that we thought we were going to see. And the last minute, they substituted in 202, which had been a 2-page bill. that specifically addressed the fact that, you know, we all got lots and lots and lots of applications from third-party nonprofits from out of state to encourage us to vote via absentee ballot, sometimes even after we had voted absentee ballot. So the original version of 202 was meant to sort of cap that and require nonprofits to check a list to see whether or not people had already applied for an absentee ballot or sent one in, and to not send any more applications if we'd already applied, which that's not a bad thing. I know I was throwing out a lot of paper applications that I didn't need. But that went from 2 pages to 95 pages to 96 pages to 98 pages in the course of 3 days. And again, the day it passed out of the House and then passed out of the Senate and then went to the governor's office into his desk in like a 6-hour period, there were still amendments that were made on the floor that we didn't see until after it had been signed. The other thing was there was no fiscal note, and fiscal notes are needed when something's going to have a big impact on the budget. And I know Representative Brunel requested a fiscal note repeatedly in the Special Committee for Election Integrity Committee, and was waived off. And then I think both Senator Jen Jordan and Senator Elena Parent asked for a fiscal note, or asked not to have the bill brought to the floor of the Senate without a fiscal note, and they were both overruled by the lieutenant governor. So that's another thing. It has a huge fiscal impact for counties, and we have no real clue of what that fiscal impact is going to be until we have an election and see what it ends up costing us.
Right. And the other thing is that in addition to not having the correct information to deal with, they only allowed certain people in to testify at a time. You can have more than 12 people in a room. Secondly, they allowed some people to testify via Zoom, some they wouldn't allow to testify. They told some people you had to be in person. Some people they told, oh, you can be on Zoom. But it was not consistent. It wasn't transparent, in addition to all the things that Susannah spoke of.
So let's spend a little bit of time talking about what the League of Women Voters and your members can do to make sure that they get notice and have the ability to participate in these apparently many processes to determine who gets chosen and who can serve on these independent groups, on these oversight committees, on the elections board.
So I think the first thing, one of the things the bill says in a couple of places is that the state election board has to promulgate rules and regulations to actually implement this law. So they left a lot up to the state election board to figure out once the bill was passed. So one thing we need to do, all of us, is to keep track of those state election board meetings where they're going to be making those decisions and passing those rules and regulations. We'll have more information if we listen in on those meetings about how they're going to put together these, oversight committee, the review panels, and how we can apply. Hopefully will be made apparent in these meetings. So that's the first step, is just keep track of what's happening at those meetings. They have them at least monthly, sometimes more than monthly. And they are required to put out an agenda so you know whether or not they're going to be talking about these things. So
well, they have to post the rules that are going to be promulgated for this. They have to be posted, and the public has to have a testimony, ability to testify about these rules. So we, like Susannah said, we need to keep up with that so that we can have our input into how they should select people and be a part of the process. So we can give them the way that we think it should operate. Not to say that they're going to do that. I can tell you that right now, but at least you can have your input into it.
How was the state elections board comprised prior to SB 202? It sounds as if it was very, very, and I should know that, and I'm sorry that I don't, but I can't be the only one. Not as complicated as what you ladies have described in the last 10, 15 minutes.
Well, the state election board was chaired by the Secretary of State, which is an elected position. Then you had 2 appointments by the majority party. Then you had an appointment. Well, you had one by the lieutenant governor, one by the governor, one by the speaker, I think.
I think so.
No, one by the party and one by the both parties. So you had 5. So right now it's going to be the legislature gets the majority 3 votes, and 1, each party gets 1, I believe. So it will be legislatively swayed by one party, let me put it that way, even though it was already that way anyway. Because one party, the minority party, only had 1 person on the board. But now the weight goes to the legislature.
And how
and that
long
means
are the terms going to be for these people who serve on the board?
Is it 2 years? I actually don't remember if it's 2 years or not.
I believe it's 2 years, but then if I remember correctly, I'm getting all my years put together here, but I believe it's 2 years, but they can still be reappointed.
Without any sort of term limits?
Correct.
Correct.
Let's talk about these performance reviews some more. If 5 performance reviews are requested, but the state election board can only suspend up to 4 election superintendents at one time, how do you decide which 4 have to go and which one gets to stay until the next go round of suspending people?
That will be promulgated in the rules, because right now we don't know how that selection will be made. I'm sure they would have some objective criteria that would perhaps say this one had more violations than this one, or something like that. I don't know, that's documented that you could go and see, but who knows what it's going to be. Right now, the state election board will basically make that determination. So, and I think it was the lieutenant governor had an appointment and the speaker had an appointment to the board, by the way. I'm sorry. I think I said governor.
I understand. Let's talk about overseas military ballots. Before, they were due not more than 3 days after the election day. What impact does SB 202 have on this deadline? Susannah.
My understanding is that it doesn't, because that is sort of governed by the United States Overseas Military Bill, UOCAVA. So the state law can't supersede federal law in that regard. So they'll still have the same amount of time to get their ballots in. So that's one good thing. They have actually also added, they've shortened the time frame for runoff elections and created an absentee, or for overseas military, they now have a ranked choice voting, so that one of the reasons we were required by the federal government to have that 9-week period for federal elections is so that overseas military could get their runoff a ballot, receive it, and send it back in time. 4 weeks is not really enough time to do that. So now they've cut the time for runoffs to 4 weeks, but overseas military will be able to vote a ranked choice ballot. So that's going to be interesting.
Choice ballot. I don't understand what that means.
It's interesting. It's actually something that several other countries do. It actually allows for the voter to rank their preference of each of the candidates. So if there are 5 candidates, they can rank their preference 1 to 5. And then the tabulation process is, if your number 1 doesn't get enough votes to get past the halfway mark, that person's dropped off, but then they look to see who your number 2 person was, and that person then gets the votes. And so until you get to that majority plus one. So it's an interesting concept. It's a way to avoid runoffs, and we're testing it out with our overseas military going forward.
Is this something that's in practice in other states with respect to these types of votes?
Yes, it alleviates runoff elections. In other words, you don't have the expense of going back to do a second election if the during the first iteration of the count tabulation, you don't have a majority plus one. So then this will allow you to, as Susannah said, go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whichever is one drops off, the least one drops off, then the next ones go up, get those. It's a good process. And we had actually wanted to introduce that for all runoff elections, and but it got to just the military that they're going to try it out. If it doesn't work to their advantage, they may drop it.
Do these same guidelines that have been outlined for military ballots, does that rule apply for Georgians, American citizens who are on assignment in, outside of the country?
You mean that the 5-day or the 3-day time
Right.
frame? Yeah. So if they are governed by the Uniform Overseas Military Citizen Act, then they've got the same requirements, or the law applies to them as well as to the military.
So a Home Depot, Coca-Cola employee, think of any Fortune 500 company that is headquartered in Atlanta, and those people are working overseas. The rules that apply to the military also apply to them, correct?
I think so. Am I right about that, Ms. Helen? I'm pretty sure that does. Yeah.
Yes.
All right, let's talk about adding up the count. How does SB 202, how do the tabulation provisions impact provisional ballots, the curing of provisional and military ballots?
The curing of provisional ballots still has the 3-day period under the law. That didn't change with 202. So if you forgot your ID, you still have 3 days within which you'll vote a provisional ballot, and you have 3 days to cure that provisional ballot. As same as you do with the military, it will end up 3 days after election day. So on that Friday, that's when you'd have to cure the ballots. But the provisional requirements have not changed with that respect.
So that's if you forgot your ID. What if you, I don't know, brought the wrong one? You still get 3 days to fix it and make it right?
Correct. But what happens with other provisional ballots, say for instance, if I voted out of precinct, for instance, if I got to my polling location and I was not at the right polling location, under HAVA, I'm entitled to a provisional ballot that I can vote a provisional ballot regardless. If I'm at the precinct, then my votes would count for those races that I would have been eligible for. SB 202 doesn't allow me to cast a provisional ballot unless it's after 5 p.m. If I get there before 5 p.m. and ask for a provisional ballot, they may give me one, but my votes will not count at all. Whereas before, if I could go there before 5 p.m. and I didn't want to go to my polling location, I would ask for, give me the ballot, and for those races that I would be eligible for, my vote would count. But under 202, it will not count. So if you're voting out of precinct, then it has to be after 5 p.m. for you to get a provisional ballot that will count for the races that you would be entitled to vote on.
And that's on the off chance that you get there and you finally get to the front of the line. It's after 5 p.m. Let's say you're in a highly populated metro Atlanta County and you discover that you are at the wrong precinct. There's 2 hours left in voting. You vote the provisional ballot for the races for which you are eligible. there and don't risk going to where I guess you were supposed to be and then standing in that line, maybe getting to the front of the line by 7 o'clock, maybe not. Is that what
Right.
you're saying?
But if you go on your lunch break and it takes an hour to get to the front of the line, they're going to tell you you've got to go to your actual precinct if you want to cast a ballot that counts.
And it is for people like that. For instance, I've known poll workers to tell people that were at the right polling location that they had to go to another polling location. It doesn't account for things like that because that just means that you're just out of luck. Your vote won't count if you got there before 5 p.m. If you go where they tell you to go and based on traffic, you can't get back to your other polling location, you're just out of luck. And that does happen a lot. So none of that has been taken into consideration when they did this bill. I didn't see the need for it, quite honestly, because it gave the voter the option to vote a provisional ballot, and the voter would know that they would only count for the races that they were eligible for. But at this point, they take away all of your eligibility for any race. So with the way it's written now.
Ms. Butler, there's an old rule in marketing that says, you know, a confused mind will say no. Is it your sense that the things that you've just described having the potential for happening might discourage voters from participating in the process?
Oh, quite so. I mean, people get frustrated if I've stood in line for 2 hours and I get to the front of the line and you tell me that, no, you are at the wrong place, you got to go somewhere else, I'm not going to let you vote, even though you have the capability of voting a provisional ballot. They're going to say, no, you need to go where your polling location is. Yes, that discourages people from voting. It would discourage me, but we're telling voters, don't be discouraged. Do it. We need all the numbers we can get.
Lots of counties in rural areas and in the cities get grant funding from philanthropic organizations. Now, under this new law, those election offices could no longer directly receive those dollars, and the state election board would propose a method on how those donations might come in and how they might be distributed in a more equitable fashion. Any current information on why this change and what would the process be for this method? And will there be any opportunity for people to weigh in and say, hey, this is a good idea, no, this is a bad idea? Susannah?
So I think we saw, because of the pandemic, I think largely because of the pandemic, we saw a lot of philanthropic organizations, including the Center for Tech and Civic Life, the Schwarzenegger Foundation, and others, send a lot of grant money to districts throughout the state. I think any county in the state that wanted money for drop boxes were given money for drop boxes from these organizations. But also, you know, additional funds to help them, you know, deal with the influx of absentee ballots that were unusual. And I think certain members of the legislature were concerned about who was sending this money, that, you know, some counties might have gotten more money than other counties, like, you know, the urban counties got a lot of money. I know my county, which is DeKalb, got a very large amount of money. I suspect that Fulton County got at least as much, if not more, but smaller rural counties didn't get as much money because their elections offices didn't need it, because just the size of their district or the counties and the number of voters. But the legislature felt like everyone should have equal access to the funds. That was one of their reasonings. I think the other was just, you know, we don't know who's spending this money and, you know, what impact it might have and what nefarious reasons they might have for trying to make sure our elections ran smoothly. So they wanted to put a limit on it for that reason. We don't know yet what the state election board is going to decide about how to distribute funds that might be sent in. But as we said earlier about the board, the oversight committees and the review panels, we need to show up at the state election board meetings, offer our advice on what they're talking about, what rules to put into place, and hope that they take on board some of the thoughts that organizations like ours want to share about how best to deal with funding from nonprofits.
And I want to set the record straight. All of the counties had an option to apply for those funds.
Yep.
There was no basic criteria. All you had to do was fill out the application to say what you were going to use it for and how much you wanted. A lot of the counties, election people refused to do that. I know. How do I know that? Because I contacted some trying to get them apply to both the Schwarzenegger Institute as well as Civic Tech. So they refused not to. But of course, the state legislature tried to use that as a reasoning for taking the ability for private industry to give funds to and saying that they could sway the outcome of an election. They didn't tell the people they didn't say, which county are you supporting? Are you a red county? Are you a blue county? They just said, what do you need? Apply for it. And people apply for it. That's how Fulton County got the mobile voting units, because they applied for those units. They were creative, and they wanted to be able to get things done. So every county, and how do I know that? Because I know I'm a member of a board of elections. So some of the calls that they had with the state election office, with the election officials, they advertised themselves that there were nonprofits who were giving money away, and all you had to do was apply for it. So let's dispel that myth that It was one set of rules for one urban versus rural. It wasn't. Everybody could apply.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure only 6 out of the 159 counties, only 16 did not have drop boxes. Everybody else applied to get funding to make sure that they had drop boxes. So it's actually, it's pretty good turnout for 16 out of 159 is not bad.
Right.
I would have preferred to see all 159 have drop boxes, but most counties stepped up and realized that this was the smart thing to do for their constituents.
And isn't it correct that SB 202 now reduces the numbers of drop boxes in some counties and other locations?
So it does require every county to have a drop box, which is a good thing. But yes, it is going to have a big impact on urban counties or counties with large populations. DeKalb County had 30. I forget how many Fulton County had, but it had to be.
Fulton County had 38. Will now go to 8 because it's one drop box for every 100,000 voters. So Fulton goes from 38 down to 8.
And DeKalb's going from 30 to 5. So it's having a huge impact. And I think similar is happening in Cobb County.
And what was the reasoning behind that?
Equity is the reason that we were given. It does not actually achieve equity, but that was the reason we were given. And actually, research was done when our organizations were trying to get counties to get drop boxes last year. I forget which organization, but I think the ideal is to have one drop box for every 15,000 voters. So limiting it to one for every 100,000 does not come anywhere close to the ideal number of drop boxes. Hopefully we won't be in a pandemic next year, but even so, if we want people to exercise the right to vote, we should make it as easy as possible. And the best way to have drop boxes is to have one for every 15,000 voters.
And drop boxes now can only be inside. They cannot be outside. And they can only be at advanced voting locations. And they have to close when they close the polling location. They cannot be there 24 hours like they were before. So they're very limited. In fact, they're useless because now they have to be inside. They have to be watched by someone. They have to have a person watching them and all that kind of good stuff. So it negates the use of a drop box, really.
Explain to our audience, what is the definition of line warming? I know there's a lot of discussion on that back and forth, and can you share with our audience what was the final ruling on that?
So line warming is, in places where you have long lines and, long wait times to actually get to the front of the line to cast your ballot. Volunteers, oftentimes, or most of the time, 99% of the time, it is nonpartisan, nonprofits like ours go and make sure that the people in line, if it's raining, they have ponchos or umbrellas. If it's hot, that they have water, food, seats for old folks, or to help, let them know that they can go to the front of the line. If you're over a certain age, you get to skip the line, but people don't necessarily know that. So, line warmers basically there to make the wait as palatable as possible so that people don't get out of line because they're discouraged. But they are not allowed to campaign within 150 feet of the polling location. That has always been the case. And so line warmers really were there to make sure that people had food and water if they needed it, that they, had an umbrella if they needed it, or a poncho, or, things to make sure that they're not going to freeze or, burn up in the sun or melt in the rain. But no campaigning, just making that line a little bit easier to withstand. And the current rule under SB 202 is that line warming is not allowed.
And it criminalizes you for doing that, which is crazy. For giving a 90-year-old lady who's standing in line a seat, a bottle of water, a snack, because she's been there for 2 hours, that is who may be diabetic or something and forgot. People don't go to the polling location thinking they're going to stand in line for 2 hours. There were some people standing in line 9 hours. Mm-hmm. So, it's unrealistic. And if you have to go to a bathroom break, you can't, you'd have to get out of line. So now you can't replace people in the lines. It's all of that kind of good stuff that is called line warming. That would assist the voters.
All right, let's talk a little bit about ballots and scanning images, because now those are going to be subject to record disclosures. The Secretary of State's office is supposed to create some sort of a program for posting these images online. Is there any more information about what these scanned ballot images, what that means, and what is the purpose of all of this?
Well, it was built on a lie, basically, I think, false information. That there were fraudulent ballots, that people made up ballots because they were done. The paper looked different, it looked new. And when you go to do election observation, you can observe the tabulation process, but you can't go close enough to pick up the ballot so you can see how that person marked it. So now they're going to do a scan process of all the ballots, I guess, that are out there, because they're open to open records requests, so that people can see them. You don't have to do an open records request. I guess they'll be online for us to just pull down. But you can't identify that to a particular voter. So just the scan ballot, other than it will have the precinct's name up there, you may identify how many ballots were cast at a particular precinct, but you'll have to go through there one by one to do it, or either have your own scanning process once you download them on your website or something. But I mean, if you don't have that capability, you got to sit there manually and determine how many ballots were cast at a particular precinct. But it's there just to satisfy people who said there was fraud when there was no fraud in the ballots. I mean, it's supposed to make it more accessible. Voters can really see everything, but it really doesn't tell you anything.
And it adds to the cost of executing the election, I would assume, correct?
Yeah.
That's the only thing it does.
Okay, so now given all the challenges that we experienced as voters, getting an absentee ballot in the mail in a timely manner in the last election, what do you think the rationale is for counties now mailing out absentee ballots, or at least being required to mail out these ballots 3 weeks later than the 2020 election?
There's really no sense to it. Like, it doesn't make sense. I understand to an extent why they put the timeline. You know, they can't send a ballot out 11 days before an election, and I get that to an extent. It doesn't take into account, you know, emergencies. The governor would have actually not been able to vote in the election under this SB 202 because he'd been exposed to COVID and was quarantining. So the end cap doesn't make sense in that regard, but it makes slightly more sense. You don't want to sending out a ballot the Friday before an election is really not enough time for a voter to receive it and get it back on time. But shortening the period to actually send it out doesn't make sense. And I don't understand the logic behind it. I don't think there's a real good rationale for it.
And we seem to be hearing a lot of that this evening. Hey, there's one change that local officials are embracing. It's a section in SB 202 that allows them to begin processing, but not actually tabulating the absentee ballots 2 weeks before the election. Will this rule change apply only to the mail-in ballots or to both ballots that are mailed in advance and left in a drop box? Ms. Butler.
It would be both, because Dropbox is an absentee ballot, by the way. So when they get it, as long as they process it and verify that it's eligible to be tabulated, then they can scan it. So it's going to be, and since it now will be inside anyway, and there's no where for it to go, and they will bring it back in each night. So it's well, it will be counted along with the regular absentee ballot process.
So then does that mean that the drop boxes are going to go away on election day because they have to be located in advance voting locations? So if you got a ballot, you filled it out and you never got around to taking it to where it needs to go, but it's election day, you don't want to stand in line, there's no place for you to take it. You've got to go stand in line and vote.
The drop boxes are locked at the close of early voting the Friday before the election. So yeah, they will not be accessible after that Friday. So yeah, if you got your absentee ballot Friday evening, you got home from work and there's your absentee ballot you've been waiting for 3 weeks for, you will not be able to turn it into a drop box. So yeah, as Helen said earlier, it makes no sense to that rule because it really makes those drop boxes useless to voters, especially at the end of the election cycle.
So then what happens to that voter who then has to go, if we stick with your example, and cast a ballot in person on election day because he or she got home from work late and the absentee ballot came on Friday, the box has already been locked. But by the time I go, I stand in line and I'm ready to vote and I show them my license and the other ID I have to provide. But we sent you an absentee ballot. Haven't you already voted?
Bring it with you, especially in that instance. But for anyone who requests an absentee ballot but then decides to vote in person, the fastest, easiest way to cut through any questions is to have that absentee ballot with you so that they can void it and give you your real ballot, or not your real ballot because it is a real ballot, but they'll give you access to the machine so that you can vote on the machine rather than the absentee ballot. Otherwise, oh, sorry.
But technically, if they, they have close the absentee ballot the 11 days prior to, right?
Yeah,
And drop boxes are only to the early voting day, to the Friday before. If after that Friday, it should have been already canceled by them because they haven't received it back if they did the process properly from that time. But to be on the safe side, it should be the way Susannah said, but technically they should have canceled it already.
Talk to us about the beginning process of absentee ballot casting, and what will the safeguards be to make sure that those ballots are not actually tabulated?
You have to be there in the observation process to make sure they're doing what they're required by law to do. They're technically not able to do anything but scan them. They cannot do the final tabulation or count them until 7 p.m. on election day. So while it gives them, most counties are not going to do it the 2 weeks prior to election day. Only the larger counties will need to do that. But if people hold their ballots until the last day before, it might create a problem for them. But technically speaking, I mean, you know, the tabulation can't occur until election day. But the one caveat to that is, on election day, everything has to be tabulated. They cannot leave until election day. Everything is counted. So no matter if you've been there 19 hours, right? you got to stay there until the last thing is counted. You can't leave, or you have to be so organized that you have enough people to scan them and count them so that you can get the results by the end of the night.
So no more of this. We started on Tuesday and it got to be 3 a.m. We let our people go home. They came back at 10 the next day. You're saying that has been eliminated altogether?
yeah, and it's really buying into this false narrative that you're supposed to know the election results. I mean, and it's something that our society has come to expect, that they're going to know who's won an election on election night, but that's never been the case. And even with this rule, you still have people who have to cure their ballots who have until that Friday. You still have your overseas military voters who have until Friday for their ballots to arrive. So, and that might not be enough to sway a big election, but in a small city, those provisional ballots and those overseas military ballots could swing on an election. So the legislature has bought into this idea that everyone's supposed to know who won an election on election night. That has never been the case. And this just feeds into that expectation, and it's a false expectation.
Yes.
All right, 3 more questions. I'm going to put them to you guys rapid fire, and then we're going to give the program back and see what questions the audience has in the chat. I'll talk a little bit about these long voting lines. Any provisions in SB 202 that tackles that problem? And if so, what is it and how is it going to help?
They have the long lines. There's a provision for before, if the voting process and after the process. So if there's 2,000 or more voters at a polling location, that will create a situation where the voters aren't able to cast their ballots after, and they're in a line for more than an hour, then they have to go back and review the process, reduce the size of the polling location, and so forth. I think I got it correct.
Yeah, they can also add machines. They can choose to add machines or poll workers, but yeah, the law doesn't actually contemplate the fact that you could have a power outage. There could be a storm, and a generator gets they don't have a generator on hand, and the transformer gets hit by lightning. That can cause a line delay in a precinct that has more than 2,000 voters. But it's not because there was a problem with the precinct. It's because of acts of nature, but they still have to go and decide whether or not to split the polling location or add poll workers or additional machines.
Does SB 202 have any provisions to guarantee number of precincts per? I mean, if you have to have, if we only have drop boxes, one drop box per 100,000 voters, and you said earlier that a better solution might be one drop box per every 15,000 voters in densely populated areas of our state. Does SB 202 make any provision to make sure there are sufficient precincts so that voters don't have to stand in lines for 8, 9, 10 hours in order to cast a ballot? Ms. Butler.
Well, they're supposed to have voting machines for that would process voter every 250 voters per hour, I believe it is. But that discretion is also left up to the election officials to take into account whether who's voted early, who's voted by absentee, as to how many machines they'll need for election day. But they're supposed to have 250, a machine per 200 that will process for every 250 voters per hour. So.
Okay, then. Ladies, I want to say thank you very much. Those are all of the questions that I had for you. I want to give our program back to one of the board members for the League of Women Voters Georgia, Miss Yvonne Hodge, who has been monitoring questions in the chat. And I'm going to give the program, ma'am, now to you.
Thanks,
Good evening. We do have a few questions in the chat box, some of which have been answered, but I will raise this question again. I've heard so much back and forth about line warming. What is the final rule on that?
It is illegal to line warm. If you are concerned about having water after a long wait in line, poll locations can have freestanding water coolers that you can help yourself at, but that is it.
Okay, the next question is there something, and this deals with people standing in line and find out they're in the wrong polling place. Is there something that prohibits a group or organization from checking the polling places for a voter upon arrival to the precinct before they get to the front of the line?
No, as long as they're 150 feet from the entrance or 25 feet from the last person voter that's in line. That is the electioneering point. So as long as you're beyond those points, you are allowed to. So if there is no voter beyond the 150 feet from the polling entrance to the polling location, you can be stationed there. But if there's a voters that come up, you have to go 25 feet behind the last voter in line beyond the 150 feet. So that is the rule. So you can at all time, in other words, you might want to be in the parking lot with the table set up to say, hey, do you know your know where your polling location is? Check it here.
Right.
You can do that, but as long as it's beyond the electioneering points.
Okay, so someone can actually tell you that you're in the right polling location before you get to the front of the line.
Yes.
Okay, this question deals with Dropbox. Is it true drop boxes are no longer allowed on election day, since the drop boxes must be in advanced voting locations?
Yes. Drop boxes basically go away at 5 or 7 p.m. depending on which county you're in and their early voting rules the Friday before the election. So Fulton County will probably be 7 p.m. the Friday before the election is the last time you can use a drop box.
So no drop boxes on election day.
No.
We have another question. Will there still be affidavits to sign that you haven't executed the absentee ballot?
That you haven't returned it?
Right.
Yes.
And that's usually done when you go to vote in person. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So if you don't have actually, I'm not sure if you have your absentee ballot and surrender it. I can't remember if you have to sign the affidavit, but the affidavit will be available if you don't.
If you don't have it, you still
Okay.
have to.
Sign it. And that is the last question I have in the chat box. Yes, that's it in the chat box. Unless someone else has additional questions from the board members. Ms. Presley, back to you.
So ladies, knowing what we know now, with SB 202 now actually signed into law, what guidance do you have for your members and other voters with respect to casting ballots in the next several upcoming elections?
Well, mine for what I'm telling people is, A, know the rules for voting. Make sure you know what it takes to get an absentee ballot application. You now have to provide photo ID. Make sure you have the correct ID. If you don't, make sure you know how to get those IDs. If you need to, make sure you make a calendar. Download the calendar from the Secretary of State's website so that you know all of the locations. I know my organization is publishing what we call a green book. A green book will tell a voter everything that has changed, how they can get it, and how we can help them get it. For instance, if I don't have a Georgia driver's license or a Georgia ID, with my application, I can produce one of the HAVA documents. That means I could do a bank statement, or I could do a utility bill as long as it has my information, correct information on that. But I'd have to provide a copy of that ID with my application. So we're going to have mobile printers. So if you want to come by, you don't have your Georgia driver's license or Georgia ID, but you want to make copies of your utility bills so that you can include them with your application or your ballot, then we will be happy to let you copy them. We're not going to have that information. You take the copies with you. So it's those kinds of things that we can do. Publishing calendars with the dates of the election, so you know when it's happening. What are the rules with who can return a ballot for you? Only your immediate relative or caretaker can actually handle the application or the ballot. It used to be that I could turn in an application, I could fax in applications for voters all day long. I can't do that anymore. As an organization, it has to be the individual. What I can do as an organization, make a copier available or fax machine available for you to do that. But I can do that, but you'd have to do it yourself. I can show you how to use my machine, but you have to do it yourself. So those are the kinds of things that we need to make sure people know how to do and to help people. The disabled community, how are they going to really read an application? They no longer can vote independently that way because they have to have people to do it for them. So again, we have to make sure people have the access and they know. We have to make sure that the websites are up for each county because they're required to post information on a daily basis about how many absentee ballots have been accepted, how many have been rejected, and how many need a cure or what are in process. Same thing with provisional ballots. So we have to know that. We have to know that if I'm going to give out an absentee ballot, I can only give out a copy, an absentee ballot application, rather. I can't give out a ballot. An application that is provided by the Secretary of State. It has certain information that has to be on it. Those are the kinds of rules that we have to know to make sure people can exercise their right to vote.
That is a lot of information to process. Ladies, we are almost out of time. I want to give you, Susannah, an opportunity to make a few closing thoughts, closing remarks. Again, Ms. Butler, you'll be able to do the same, and we will conclude today's forum. Please go ahead.
So one other thing, in addition to things Helen just mentioned, I also strongly recommend checking out vote411.org. We will have information not only about the candidates, which is important. You need to know what's on the ballot so you can make an informed decision, but there will be information about all of the rules and laws, where to find your polling place so that you don't end up in the position of going to the wrong polling place. And so, definitely take advantage of vote411.org for upcoming elections, and also check your county website for those notices about polling place changes that might happen at the last minute. They've got to give you 7 days notice, but make sure you're checking just to be on the safe side. You don't want to go to the wrong polling place at 3 o'clock and not be able to vote a provisional ballot. And just, make sure you're sharing this information with your friends, family, coworkers, because there's a lot of changes in that bill, and we want people to have as much information as possible so that they can actually exercise their right to vote at all future elections. And it's important. So please make sure you vote and you keep informed.
All right, Ms. Butler, I'm going to give you the final thought before I turn our program back over to our current president. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I think we've covered everything. I think we may have missed something, but we'll be happy. Call us, check us out at thepeoplesagenda.org. It's where you can find out information, contact us. The other thing I would say is work as an election official. There are a lot of positions that are open for supervisors of elections. Pickens County right now has no election people working. So they need people to work. That office is closed right now. So we want people to be able to be poll workers and ensure that you're able to help people understand what the voting process is. Learn it and do it. Be the change.
Indeed, be the change you want to see. Madam President, we are now going to give the program back to you. And you're on mute.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Still in this whole Zoom world, we still have our fur babies who like to play with our equipment. So I want to say, first of all, thank you so much. I mean, this was so informative. We know for the last couple of months that we've had numerous conversations. I know, Helen and myself and Susannah probably have had numerous conversations about what this bill is. I mean, it is saved on my laptop. It is saved on my phone. I search keywords so I can kind of bring up the section immediately. So this has been a hot topic. So definitely thank you so much for joining us, Susannah, Helen, and Candace, doing a great forum and great informational forum for us, because people really needed to know what was beyond what the media was talking about, right? We know the key words that the media was talking about. It's voter ID and I can't get free water. That was the key things that the media was talking about. And so I really appreciate that you guys digged into this 96, 98 page. I keep hearing two different numbers, but whatever the number is, digging deep to knowing that there are so many more sections of this bill that affects Georgians day to day and when it comes to voting. So once again, I do appreciate it. Thank you to the Voter Service Committee for putting on this program. I know we are not doing candidate forums, but this does deal with voters, and they're being educated and understanding what the new rules play about. And I want to say, Ms. Butler, Helen, we are on the same page. I think I told Demetrius, I was like, listen, I'm about to buy those cheap printers for like $50. And we're going to just be setting up at Martyr and saying, hey, you want to copy your ID? You need a copier? Here you go. Because, we really do now have to, they put the rules out there, but we need to not disenfranchise. We need to not make roadblocks for our voters. And, as it's been mentioned a lot, especially with Atlanta, Fulton County, we are the largest county, we are the largest city in the state. So a lot of these changes affects our day-to-day voters here, because like I said, we're going from 38 drop boxes down to 8. You know, even though Fulton might have the leeway to maybe stay to 7, but they don't have to stay to 7 o'clock on certain days, you know, and that really hurts our metropolitan cities. So, you know, we are going to be working and trying to figure out how do we make sure that voters are still engaged and still able and empowered to cast their vote. With that said, like I said, thank you, Voter Service Committee, for putting this on. We have been doing this for a whole year. Susannah knows, as the president of for the League of Women of Georgia, you know, us in Atlanta, Fulton County, I always say, I said, we've been voting every other month. We've been fighting every other month. You know, it's like, because, you know, we started, our year starts in June, you know, we take our positions in June and stuff, and it has been nonstop since. And so I think my committees have now gotten to the hint when I'm like, hey, I got this idea. As soon as, like, you know, I knew legislation got back into office, I knew that this was coming up, not knowing that it was going to be SB 202, but we knew that these rules and legislation was coming through. That we really needed to make sure that everyone was educated, and that's the key thing: educating, empowering, and engaging our voters day in and day out. With that said, we are not ending our fiscal year, not on an easy note. We are, this Thursday, are actually tackling redistricting and reapportionment. So I know Georgia has their program kicking off on the same day, and League of Women Voters Atlanta Fulton County is also kicking off. We're doing a redistricting 101, educating the community for them to understand what it means to reapportionment and what does redistricting means, and what does it mean for your counties, your cities, your state representatives. And this is going to be one of 4-part series. We are actually planning to, like I said, we're following our theme of educating, then we're going to give them power and empower our citizens, and then our plan is to engage with our politicians and get them involved. So we are in a one part this Thursday at 6:30 p.m. You can find our event on Facebook, on Instagram, and Twitter, and please pre-register. But it's going to be a very engaging conversation, just like tonight. Just like we did last week. We actually did the Atlanta tree ordinance last week, and that is also on our Facebook page, so you can understand, if you're in the city of Atlanta, about the tree protection ordinance. We have a lot going on. And, you know, I know also come August, all of our city officials are officially declaring their positions. So we'll see how many races are going to be contested races. I know of at least 4 right now that has multiple candidates that have already declared. So we will still be chugging along in Atlanta as we usually do. So once again, I appreciate you all. And as I always say, we are a non-gender biased organization, right, Susannah?
Yep.
We accept both male and female members. So please either join League of Women Voters Atlanta Fulton County, and if you're a greater outside of Atlanta Fulton County, you can also join the state League of Women Voters Georgia. So that's lwvaf.org or lwvga.org. Once again, thank you so much, and I hope I see everyone on Thursday to learn more about redistricting. Appreciate it. Thank you, Candace. Thank you, Susannah. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Demetrius, Yvonne, Karen, and Darlene. Appreciate you all.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Have a good one.